Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It all started a few months ago. I was living in Austin, Texas, and like most people in my age group, I'd been getting more and more into gaming. The problem was I didn't have the cash to buy a brand new gaming PC. They're ridiculously expensive, especially if you want something that's gonna last. So I figured I'd check out Craigslist for a cheaper option. I wasn't looking for anything too fancy, just something that could run the newer games without constantly lagging. I spent hours scrolling through listings, getting more and more frustrated as the prices seemed to climb higher and higher. Then I came across an ad that caught my eye. It was for a used gaming PC, about 3 years old, but in excellent condition, according to the seller. The price was almost too good to be true, just $250. The description said it had a high-end graphics card, decent CPU, and a solid amount of storage. Honestly, it sounded too perfect to pass up. The seller's name was a guy called Derek, or at least that's what his profile said. His phone number was listed in the ad, and I decided to text him. Almost immediately, he replied, telling me the PC was available and that I could come pick it up that weekend. I wasn't too worried. I mean, it's Craigslist. Yeah, you hear horror stories, but I figured I'd be fine. I'd arranged to meet him at his place in a suburb about 30 minutes outside Austin. The neighborhood seemed fine from what I could tell. It wasn't a fancy area, but it wasn't exactly run down either. Just regular middle-class houses with lawns that could use a bit of care. When I pulled up, I noticed his house was kind of off. It wasn't the worst house on the block, but there was something about it that felt strange. The lawn was a mess, with overgrown grass and weeds creeping up over the driveway. The windows looked dark, even though it was only mid-afternoon and the front door was slightly ajar, like maybe he'd forgotten to close it fully. But I told myself I was being paranoid. People don't just murder strangers over $250 PCs, right? I was just nervous because I had no idea what to expect. I texted him that I was there and he told me to come inside. As I walked up to the door, I hesitated for a second. My gut was already telling me something wasn't right, but I shook it off. I knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. Derek was standing there, a man in his early 30s, tall, a bit scruffy. He had a kind of nervous energy about him, like he was rushing to get something done and didn't really care much for pleasantries. "Hey, come on in," he said quickly, stepping aside to let me through. Inside, the house smelled musty. Not bad, just old and kind of stagnant. The walls were bare, except for a few framed pictures that didn't seem to match, like random stock photos of family members or friends he didn't even know. The carpet was worn down in places, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The weirdest thing, though, was the silence. It was like the house didn't have a heartbeat. No pets, no noise coming from any other room. Just stillness. Derek led me to a room at the back of the house where he said the PC was set up. When we entered the room, I immediately felt a chill. Not a cold chill, but an uncomfortable one, like someone was watching me. The room was small, cluttered with random junk. Old furniture, stacks of papers, and a couple of cardboard boxes piled high with who knows what. In the center, there was a desk with a gaming PC sitting on it. It was one of those older models, beige with a few stickers plastered on it, nothing fancy. But it looked clean enough. "You sure this is the one?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He seemed like he was in a rush, almost too eager. "Yeah, this is it. It's been a good machine," Derek replied, his eyes darting around as though he was trying to avoid looking directly at me. I wasn't stupid. Something felt off, but the deal was good, and I really wanted the PC. Still, I decided to inspect it. I noticed right away that the cables were tangled in a way that seemed unorganized, almost haphazard. The way the wires were twisted up was something I'd never seen on a machine that had supposedly been well maintained. Before I could get another word out, Derek said, "I can't test it right now, but trust me, it works. It's a beast, runs anything you throw at it, and you're getting a steal." Something in his voice made me uncomfortable. It was like he was trying too hard to sell me on something that I wasn't sure about. As I went to reach for the PC to take a closer look, Derek stepped forward too quickly, almost too quickly. His movements felt jerky, as if he was holding back from doing something. I think we should just do the deal, man. I need to get going," he said, his tone suddenly sharp. That's when I noticed something that sent a cold chill down my spine. A picture frame on the desk. It was of a young woman, probably in her 20s, smiling happily at the camera, but what caught my attention wasn't the woman's face. It was the background, a messy room. The exact same kind of cluttered room I was standing in. I froze. My brain was starting to catch up to the weird feeling I'd had since I entered the house. "Who's that?" I asked before I could stop myself. Derek's face twitched, and for a second I thought I saw a flash of panic, maybe regret. "That's just an old picture. Don't worry about it," he said too quickly, grabbing the frame and shoving it into a drawer. It didn't sit right with me. But at the same time, I didn't want to make a scene. I had to trust that I was just being paranoid. I pushed the thoughts out of my mind. I handed Derek the $250 in cash, and he seemed to hesitate for a second before taking it. It was like he was weighing something in his head, calculating. Then, without a word, he quickly unplugged the PC, shoved it into a box, and handed it to me. "Take it," he said, his voice suddenly flat. I stood there for a second, unsure what to do. Something was definitely off, but I was too focused on getting out of there and finally having the PC to think it through. I grabbed the box and nodded. I'll head out now," I said. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. A low, soft thump, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by the faintest of movements in the hallway just behind me. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my stomach in knots. I couldn't see anyone in the hallway, but I heard it again, a slight scraping sound like something or someone was dragging itself along the floor. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted for the door. But before I could reach it, Derek's voice stopped me. "You're not leaving yet," he said, his tone cold, almost threatening. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. I froze. "Just let me go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My hands were shaking now. Derek took a step toward me. "It's too late for that." Without thinking, I turned and sprinted toward the window. It was a cheap, thin window, and the lock barely held, but in a panic, I shoved it open with all my might. I didn't look back. I didn't care. I climbed through it, half falling out of the window, barely landing on the ground outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, the engine roaring as I sped off toward safety. I reported everything to the police as soon as I got home, giving them Derek's name, the address, and the details of the encounter. They seemed to take it seriously, but nothing ever came of it. No one was ever arrested. The house, when they checked, was empty. Derek was nowhere to be found, and no one knew who he really was. I don't know if I'll ever get the full story of what happened in that house, but the one thing I'm sure of is this: I came way too close to something I can't even begin to explain. I'm 32, live in Texas, and I like to think of myself as a pretty cautious guy. I'm not the type to ignore a bad vibe or walk into something shady without a second thought. I usually trust my gut. But this time, I made the mistake of ignoring that voice in my head, and it almost cost me. I had just moved into a new apartment in Houston. It was a small place, nothing fancy, and the budget was tight. The last thing I wanted to do was spend a ton of money on furniture, so I turned to Craigslist. I've used it before, picking up a few things here and there, nothing special, just a coffee table, some chairs, basic stuff. I had never had any problems. Then I saw an ad that caught my eye. Dining table set, must sell. Great condition, cheap. The pictures looked great. A solid wood table, 6 chairs, priced at almost half what I'd pay in a store. It was exactly the style I wanted. The guy who went by Eric said he was moving out of state and needed to get rid of the set ASAP. I figured, perfect. I could use the table and save a ton of cash. I sent him a message, and to my surprise, he replied quickly. He seemed pretty friendly, told me I could come by later that evening to check it out. Now, here's where I should have been smarter. I noticed he wanted me to come by around 7 p.m. Something about it just felt off. I mean, I wasn't buying a couch or something I'd have to load up into a truck. This was a dining table. Why so late? But he said it was because he worked during the day, and I figured maybe it wasn't a big deal. People have odd schedules, right? Plus, the place wasn't far from my apartment, just a warehouse near an industrial part of town. When I pulled up to the warehouse, I immediately felt uneasy. It wasn't that it was a bad neighborhood, but it was definitely a little sketchy. The area was quiet. There weren't many other cars around, and the streetlights flickered like they were about to die. I parked my car near the entrance and texted Eric to let him know I'd arrived. He responded right away, saying he'd be right out. I waited for a few minutes, but no one came. The place was completely dark except for a single dim light above the entrance. I was about to leave when I saw a figure step out of the shadows. He waved at me, and I rolled my window down just enough to hear him. "Hey, you here for the table?" he asked, grinning. His voice was too cheerful, almost forced. I nodded. "Yeah, are you Eric?" He smiled again and nodded. "Yep, that's me. Come on in." Something about his smile didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off. He didn't seem dangerous. He was just a guy looking to sell some furniture, right? When I stepped inside, the air hit me like a wave, musty, stale, like no one had been there in ages. The warehouse was a mess. There were old boxes everywhere and piles of random furniture. Nothing looked like it belonged in an actual furniture sale. The place was dark, and the dim light above us didn't help. Eric led me through the narrow aisles between shelves stacked high with furniture and junk. It felt like I was walking through some kind of maze, and the further we went, the more the place gave me the creeps. I kept glancing behind me, feeling like something wasn't right. "It's just back here," Eric said, his voice echoing off the empty walls. We got to the back of the warehouse, and I froze. The table was supposed to be there, but all I saw were broken chairs, an old mattress, and a bunch of rusty tools scattered across the floor. Where's the table?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Eric scratched the back of his neck, looking a little flustered. "Oh, it's here somewhere. I moved it earlier. Give me a second." That's when I heard it. A faint shuffling sound from behind me, like someone was dragging something across the floor. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the shadows. My stomach twisted. "What was that?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Probably just the wind," Eric replied, but his words didn't sound convincing. Something in me told me to get out of there. I was already regretting this whole thing, and now I was feeling more and more like I was walking into a trap. "You know what? I think I'll pass on the table," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks anyway." But before I could turn around, Eric stepped in front of me, blocking my way. "Hold on," he said, his tone suddenly changing. It was no longer friendly. "You came all the way out here. At least let me show you something else." I took a step back. "No, I'm good," I said, feeling my heart rate spike. "I think I'll just leave." That's when I saw him. Out of the corner of my eye, a man stepped out from behind one of the shelves. He was taller, heavier, and looked much more intimidating, and he was holding something in his hand, a crowbar. My blood ran cold. I could feel the panic rise in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Eric said, his voice now flat, almost angry. I knew instantly that this was bad. I wasn't dealing with some guy trying to sell furniture anymore. I was in danger. "I don't want any trouble," I said, backing up slowly. "I'll just leave." The bigger guy took a step closer, and I knew I needed to get out of there, fast. But my phone was still in the car, and there was no way to call for help. My eyes darted around the warehouse, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. That's when I saw it, a rusty metal pipe leaning against the wall. Without thinking, I grabbed it and swung it at Eric as hard as I could. The pipe hit him square in the shoulder, and he stumbled back, cursing. But the bigger guy lunged at me, and I ducked, dodging his grasp. My heart was pounding in my ears as I bolted through the maze of shelves. I could hear them behind me shouting, their footsteps pounding closer. But somehow I managed to make it to the door. I flung it open and sprinted to my car, barely even thinking. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and hit the gas pedal like my life depended on it. Because it did. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back at my apartment. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key to unlock the door. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. I called the police, but I have no idea if they ever did anything about it. Honestly, it feels like one of those things that's too crazy to believe, but I know what I saw. I know what happened. I haven't used Craigslist since then. In fact, I don't think I ever will. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's to trust my instincts. If something feels off, trust it. If you're meeting a stranger, don't go alone. And always, always be cautious. I'm a single guy in my mid-30s living in Austin, Texas. I work as a graphic designer, so I'm at my computer most of the day. I've always been a pretty private person, and I keep a small circle of friends. Selling stuff online was never something I'd done before, but I had this old guitar sitting around collecting dust. It was a decent Fender Strat, nothing special, but I figured it was worth a couple $100. I listed it on Craigslist, thinking it'd be an easy way to make some extra cash. Within an hour, I got a message from someone named Brandon. His message was friendly enough. He said he'd been looking for a Strat like mine for a while and asked if I'd be willing to meet up. He seemed normal, and his profile picture, yes, I Googled his email, was just a guy in his late 20s with shaggy brown hair. Nothing about him set off alarms. We agreed to meet in a public spot, a busy coffee shop downtown. He showed up on time and seemed friendly. Brandon was a little awkward, but not in a creepy way, just kind of shy. He checked out the guitar, strummed a few chords, and handed me the cash. Simple, right? I thought that was the end of it. The first message came later that evening. Brandon texted to say thanks again and asked if I played in a band. I didn't think much of it. People make small talk. I replied with something short and polite, saying no, I just played for fun and hadn't touched the guitar in years. He didn't respond, and I forgot about it. A week later, he sent another message. Hey man, just wanted to let you know the guitar's great. You ever think about jamming sometime? That's when I started to feel a little weird. I didn't know this guy, and we'd only met for a 5-minute transaction. I told him I was busy with work and left it at that. But Brandon didn't leave it at that. Over the next few weeks, he kept messaging me. Sometimes it was about the guitar. Other times it was just random stuff like, hey, what's up? Or, do you know any good places to eat in Austin? I stopped replying altogether, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. One night I was sitting on my couch watching Netflix when I got a notification. It was Brandon again. Hey, I drove by that coffee shop where we met. You live around there, right? My stomach dropped. How did he know that? I hadn't mentioned anything about where I lived. I ignored the message, but it rattled me. The next day, I double-checked all my social media to make sure nothing was public. My profiles were already private, but I tightened up every setting I could find. I also considered blocking his number but hesitated. I didn't want to escalate things. Then came the night that really shook me. It was around 10 p.m., and I was getting ready for bed when my phone buzzed. Another message from Brandon. "I'm outside." I froze. My heart started pounding as I stared at the screen. Was he joking? I live in a small apartment complex with gated entry. There's no way he could just be outside. I wanted to believe it was a weird, bad taste joke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was serious. I walked to my window and peeked through the blinds. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed a car parked across the street. A guy was sitting in the driver's seat, illuminated by his phone screen. It was too dark to see his face clearly, but my gut told me it was him. I grabbed my phone and called the non-emergency police line. While I waited for them to show up, I kept an eye on the car. After about 15 minutes, it drove off. The cops arrived shortly after, but there wasn't much they could do. They told me to call again if he came back and suggested I think about getting a restraining order. The next day, I blocked Brandon's number and reported his email to Craigslist. I hoped that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things that made me uneasy. I'd find footprints outside my apartment window or hear faint knocks on my door late at night. Once I came home to find a sticky note on my door that just said, "Hey." I bought a security camera and set it up facing my front door. A few nights later, around 2 a.m., the motion detector went off. I checked the footage and saw a man, tall and lanky, wearing a hoodie, standing at my door. He didn't knock or try to get in. He just stood there for a few minutes before walking away. I couldn't see his face, but I'm almost certain it was Brandon. That was the final straw. I took the footage to the police and filed for a restraining order. They said they'd look into it, but as far as I know, nothing came of it. I even considered moving, but finding a new place in Austin isn't easy, and I couldn't afford to break my lease. It's been a few months now, and things have quieted down. I haven't heard from Brandon or noticed anything unusual, but I still feel on edge, like I'm always looking over my shoulder. I don't sell things online anymore, and I've become a lot more cautious about who I interact with. If there's one thing I've learned from this whole experience, it's to trust your instincts. If someone seems off, even just a little, don't ignore that feeling. I don't know what Brandon's deal was or what he wanted from me, and honestly, I'm fine never finding out. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.